When police cars tear down a seemingly peaceful street at dusk, an unsettling tension grips the neighborhood, a sign that something quietly sinister is about to surface. The lights flash against a dreary sky, and a hush falls over the once comfortable homes. Before we explore the unexpected truth behind this disturbance and the chance encounter that changes everything, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe in the power of courage, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Lily had always been a gentle child with a quiet spirit. She was the sort of girl who loved reading mysteries but rarely spoke in class, content to admire the bolder students from a distance. People said she saw the world through soft eyes, always ready to help. She lived with her parents in a modest one-story house on a street lined with maples. The leaves turned fiery red each autumn, a sight she adored. She would walk the sidewalk after school, head bent, rummaging through her own daydreams. The biggest excitement in her 12-year-old life usually came from the occasional yard sale or a stray cat wandering into someone's yard. On the day she saw the police cars, however, she didn't yet know how her neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, was involved or how a single conversation over the fence would unravel everything Lily thought she understood about her world. A few weeks earlier, Lily had noticed Mrs. Hargrove watching her from the far side of the fence that separated their properties. The old woman gave a small wave. Lily, shy but polite, waved back. Mrs. Hargrove was new to the street, or knew enough that Lily knew little about her. The neighbor who'd lived there before had been a cheery elderly man who passed away the previous summer. Everyone assumed the property would go up for sale, and eventually this white-haired lady arrived with little fanfare. Lily's mother, Harriet, had greeted Mrs. Hargrove once or twice, but Lily's father, Robert, had only glimpsed her from afar. Sometimes Lily heard them guess about her age or wonder if she had family around. They weren't nosy people, though, and Mrs. Hargrove kept to herself. One breezy autumn afternoon, Lily was outside picking up sticks in the yard, her parents' version of chores. She heard a gravelly voice say, "Hello there, dear." Startled, Lily turned to see Mrs. Hargrove peeking over the fence, her pale blue eyes crinkling at the edges in what looked like a kind smile. The woman wore a faded floral sweater, her hair in a neat bun. Lily offered a hesitant greeting, not sure how to make small talk with someone so much older. Mrs. Hargrove struck up a conversation, asking Lily about her school, her hobbies, whether she enjoyed living on this quiet street. The questions seemed innocent enough, so Lily answered politely. After a few minutes, the old woman sighed and mentioned that she missed having a youngster around, that her own family had drifted apart long ago, that she used to have nieces and nephews. She trailed off, her voice tinged with a sadness that pulled at Lily's sympathetic heart. Then she brightened and asked if Lily would like some fresh cookies she'd baked. Lily, charmed and hungry, nodded. That was how their tentative friendship began. Lily climbed the small gate that separated the yards and was welcomed into Mrs. Hargrove's kitchen. The place smelled of warm sugar and a hint of old lady perfume. Framed photos cluttered the walls, but Lily couldn't get a good look before Mrs. Hargrove steered her to the table and offered her a plate of sugar cookies dusted with cinnamon. They were unexpectedly delicious. Mrs. Hargrove beamed as Lily devoured them, calling them an old family recipe passed down from her grandmother. A comfortable silence fell between them. Lily glanced around, noticing the old-fashioned decor, lace doilies, porcelain figurines, a ticking grandfather clock in the corner. It felt cozy, almost timeless. From that day on, Lily found herself waving more often when she saw Mrs. Hargrove in the yard, and the old woman would occasionally invite her over. Lily's parents didn't mind, especially since Mrs. Hargrove seemed pleasant. Harriet even told Lily, "It's nice of you to keep her company. She probably doesn't have anyone to talk to." Lily took those words to heart. Her mother was right. Mrs. Hargrove looked lonely, living alone in a house that seemed bigger than she could manage. The more Lily visited, the more the old woman talked. She had a habit of spinning stories about her past, about relatives who parted ways, about old hurts that never healed. Sometimes Lily came over to sweep the porch or help carry groceries. Mrs. Hargrove would offer her tea and regale her with tales that were half nostalgia, half sorrow. She mentioned a sister who had died young, parents lost in a tragic accident, and cousins who drifted away after feuds over inheritance. Lily never pressed for details, finding it rude to pry. She simply listened, feeling compassion for someone who'd apparently faced so much loss. Yet even as Lily's sympathy grew, she noticed inconsistencies. Sometimes the details changed from visit to visit. The years didn't match up, or the cause of death for a certain relative shifted from an accident to an illness. It might have been memory lapses of an elderly mind, Lily thought. But a part of her, shaped by reading detective novels, felt a twinge of suspicion. She tried to brush it aside. One Friday afternoon, Lily stopped by after school to drop off a small plant Harriet had wanted to gift the old woman. Lily let herself in the side gate. She heard voices inside the kitchen, Mrs. Hargrove talking in a low, urgent tone. Lily was about to knock when she caught fragments of a sentence. "If they don't pay, I have other methods. If they owe me." Lily paused, confusion prickling her mind. She stood there, uncertain whether to announce herself, when Mrs. Hargrove ended the call. Lily decided to pretend she just arrived. She tapped on the door frame. The old woman emerged, eyes flicking with startled annoyance before softening into a smile. "Oh, Lily dear," she said. "I didn't hear you come in. Everything all right?" "Sorry," Lily mumbled, stepping inside. "I have this plant, from my mom." She set the small pot on the table. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Mrs. Hargrove shook her head. "No, no, I'm always happy to see you." Her tone was light, but Lily couldn't forget the steely edge she'd heard moments before. She glanced at the phone cradle on the counter. Something about the old woman's posture had changed. It was as though she'd gone on guard. "Are you okay?" Lily asked quietly. "You sounded upset." Mrs. Hargrove's eyebrows lifted, and for a second Lily thought she saw a flicker of impatience. Then it vanished. "Oh, just a bit of a misunderstanding with, well, an old friend. We have some complicated financial matters. Nothing you need to worry about." She patted Lily's shoulder, steering the conversation to more mundane topics. Lily let it pass, but a seed of unease took root. On Saturday, Lily's father had to work a shift at his office, so Harriet and Lily were home together. Harriet asked Lily how Mrs. Hargrove was doing, and Lily hesitated, unsure how to describe the tension she'd felt. Eventually, she said she was on the phone with someone, talking about money, kind of angrily. It just seemed weird. Harriet smiled wryly. "She's old, honey. Probably stressing over bills or something. Elderly folks sometimes worry about money a lot. Don't read too much into it." Harriet gave Lily's hair a gentle ruffle. Lily didn't push the matter. She didn't want to sound like an alarmist child who read a single conversation all wrong. Days turned into weeks. Lily went back to her routine of school, chores, homework. She visited Mrs. Hargrove intermittently. The old woman's stories grew more colorful. She mentioned tragedies in the extended family, some cousin losing a child, another relative disappearing under suspicious circumstances, a third who tried to hire a detective to investigate a kidnapping. The recollections poured out in a wistful sigh, as though she lamented being surrounded by endless misfortune. Lily's ears pricked at the mention of kidnapping. She remembered the phone call she'd partially overheard. Something about those references to lost or missing children unsettled her, but whenever she brought up these stories to Harriet, her mother would nod vaguely, not attributing any real significance to them. It was a sunny afternoon when Lily first stumbled upon evidence that her neighbor's stories might be more than just the ramblings of an old mind. Lily had dropped by to bring a plate of homemade banana bread Harriet had baked. She knocked softly. When she stepped inside, she found Mrs. Hargrove rummaging through an old trunk in the living room. The old woman quickly shut the trunk, turning with a forced smile. "Why, Lily? I was just sorting some old keepsakes. Come in, dear. Have a seat." Lily set the banana bread on a doily-covered coffee table. She couldn't help noticing that the trunk's lid wasn't fully closed, and a stack of photographs peeked out. A few of children around Lily's age, though she didn't recognize them. Mrs. Hargrove motioned for Lily to sit, offering her a glass of lemonade. Lily, her curiosity aflame, tried not to stare at the trunk, but her mind churned. She asked, "Are those your family pictures?" Mrs. Hargrove's face tightened. "Just some old memories," she said coolly, then brightened artificially. "Now, how's school? Are you enjoying your teachers?" Lily sensed a wall going up in the conversation, so she nodded and talked about her classes. Meanwhile, she kept one eye on the trunk, wishing she could see the photos better. She saw a couple were black and white, others color, many quite old. She wondered who those children were. A couple of days later, Harriet suggested Lily do something kind, like vacuuming for Mrs. Hargrove. The old woman had mentioned having trouble lifting furniture to clean underneath. Lily agreed, though part of her was uneasy about rummaging in that house. Still, she arrived one Wednesday after school, vacuum in hand. Mrs. Hargrove smiled in appreciation, pointing Lily to the living room, telling her to get behind the couch if she could. Lily moved the furniture with effort, noticing how dusty it was. Then, while vacuuming, she discovered a small photograph on the floor, partially hidden by the couch's leg. She picked it up, intending to hand it to Mrs. Hargrove. The picture showed a young girl with braids, maybe around 9 or 10, standing in front of a mailbox. Lily's heart skipped when she noticed the girl's face had been crudely cut from the photo. Only the lower half of her body and the background remained. A wave of discomfort washed over Lily. Who cut out the girl's face? And what? She debated whether to mention it, but she feared Mrs. Hargrove might get upset. So Lily slipped the picture into her pocket, planning to figure out how to ask about it later. Her instincts told her something was amiss, yet she didn't want to accuse the old woman of anything. After finishing the vacuuming, Lily found Mrs. Hargrove in the kitchen, sipping tea. The old woman asked, "Did you find anything interesting behind the couch?" Lily forced a neutral smile. "Just dust," she said quietly, and Mrs. Hargrove nodded. Lily wondered if the question was a test. She excused herself soon after, claiming she had homework. Back in her own room, Lily examined the photo under her desk lamp. The girl wore an old-fashioned dress. The mailbox number was partially visible, as if from a rural address. The cut around the face was jagged, almost vicious. A chill ran through Lily. She resolved to keep the photo hidden until she could figure out the right approach. That night at dinner, Harriet and Robert asked if everything was fine. Lily mumbled a yes. She considered showing them the strange photo, but she also anticipated their shrug, that they'd dismiss it as just an odd relic. Lily was tired of them telling her she was overthinking. Instead, she tried to put it aside, focusing on her schoolwork. The next day, she told a friend, Cassie, about the old woman's stories. Cassie jokingly suggested that maybe Mrs. Hargrove was a serial killer, or that she had bodies buried in her garden. Lily laughed it off but couldn't shake a disquieting sense that the truth might be even more complicated. A week later, Lily's parents let her know they'd be gone for the evening. Her father had to attend an office function, and her mother was meeting a friend across town. Lily, old enough to stay home alone for a few hours, had no objection. After finishing her homework, she decided to read a novel on the couch. The street outside was quiet, just the faint hum of a distant car or a dog barking. Around 6, the phone rang. Lily answered. Mrs. Hargrove's voice came through, slightly frantic, asking if Lily could come over to help her move some boxes in the garage. Lily hesitated. Her parents weren't home, and she usually avoided going out alone in the evenings. But the old woman sounded upset, talking about leaking pipes and needing a quick hand. Lily agreed, not wanting to abandon her neighbor if there was an emergency. She slipped on shoes and walked next door, the sky darkening with the last hues of sunset. Mrs. Hargrove greeted her at the door, beckoning her inside. "The garage is this way," she muttered, leading Lily to a side corridor. Once in the musty garage, Lily saw a few boxes stacked precariously, some water trickling from an old pipe in the ceiling. It wasn't a dramatic flood, more a steady drip. Lily helped shift a couple of boxes away from the wet area. While she did, Mrs. Hargrove rummaged in one box, pulling out old letters and envelopes. Lily glimpsed a few lines. "We demand payment, child safety." The text made her heart pound. She didn't want to stare openly, so she looked away, but the words burned into her memory. "You're a wonderful helper," Mrs. Hargrove said with a tight smile once they were done. "Let's step inside, I have some tea for you." Her tone was layered with something Lily couldn't define. Relief? Tension? She followed the old woman back into the kitchen. Mrs. Hargrove poured 2 cups of chamomile tea, gesturing for Lily to sit at the table. The overhead light flickered, adding to the unsettled atmosphere. Lily noticed the old woman's face was pinched. She sipped her tea politely. Mrs. Hargrove said, "Dear, I appreciate your kindness. I don't have anyone else I can rely on. My relatives, well, they aren't around. They abandoned me, you see." She paused, her eyes turning glassy with tears. "That's why I share my stories with you. I feel you're an understanding soul." Lily wanted to empathize. She managed a gentle smile. "I'm sorry about your family. I know it must be hard." Mrs. Hargrove nodded, gaze distant. "My sister's child was stolen away once. It was a heartbreak that never healed. People say kidnappings are rare, but oh, they happen more often than you'd think." She gave Lily a pointed look, which made the girl's stomach knot. So many children vanish. Parents pay hefty sums to see them again. Her voice trailed off into silence. Lily felt a swirl of confusion and alarm. Why was she telling this to a 12-year-old? After a lengthy pause, Lily stood. "I should probably get home. My parents might worry." Mrs. Hargrove didn't protest, just nodded in a distracted way. Lily thanked her for the tea and hurried out, her nerves frayed. Once home, she locked the door and checked the clock. Still an hour or so until her parents returned. She paced the living room, replaying those glimpses of ominous letters about payments and safety. Something about it felt real, not just a random old document. Could Mrs. Hargrove have kept extortion letters from an event in her family's past? Or was she receiving them? No, Lily had caught her referencing sums of money on the phone, like she was the one demanding it. The possibility that her neighbor might be complicit in some kind of blackmail or abduction ring struck Lily as wild, yet she couldn't shake the suspicion. That night, Harriet and Robert came home to find Lily subdued and thoughtful. Her father asked if she was feeling ill. She just shook her head, not wanting to start a conversation that might spiral into them brushing her off. She told them she was tired and went to her room early. Over the next few visits, Lily cautiously probed for more clues. She lingered in the hallway if Mrs. Hargrove disappeared into the next room, trying to glimpse any letters or photos left lying around. She noticed more pictures with missing faces, a pattern of children, each with the face carefully cut out. She spotted coded references, like "wire the money by next week or else," scrawled on a slip of paper near the telephone. Lily's heart raced whenever she thought about confronting the old woman directly, but she didn't have the courage. Instead, she confided bits of her concern to Harriet, who responded with a gentle, "You're reading too many mysteries, darling. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation." The turning point came on a drizzly afternoon. Mrs. Hargrove called Lily over, saying she needed to deliver an important envelope and that Lily's presence would help her feel safe driving across town. Lily hesitated. She had homework, and the idea of going on a random errand felt strange, but her polite instincts kicked in. She found herself climbing into the passenger seat of Mrs. Hargrove's old sedan. The car smelled faintly of mothballs and mint. Lily felt uneasy from the moment they pulled away from the curb. Rain pattered on the windshield as they drove along roads Lily wasn't familiar with. She kept checking her phone, but she had no messages from her parents. The old woman seemed preoccupied, knuckles tight on the wheel, occasionally glancing at Lily with an unreadable expression. The cityscape slid by in a blur of wet concrete and traffic lights. Lily asked softly, "Where are we going?" "Just a little meeting with someone," Mrs. Hargrove said. They owe me something, and I need to make sure they remember their promises. Her voice was firm. Lily's stomach twisted. This wasn't just some casual visit. She pressed further. What do you mean? Mrs. Hargrove gave a small sigh. I told you about that side of the family with complicated history. Some parents shouldn't be parents at all, Lily. She reached over, patted Lily's knee in a way that made her skin crawl. It's a shame when children end up in the wrong hands. Lily was starting to panic internally. The seat belt felt too tight around her. She considered texting her mom but worried the old woman would notice. She cast a nervous glance at the passing signs. They were heading toward a less developed area, warehouse buildings, vacant lots. The rain had intensified. Lily mustered the courage to say, Mrs. Hargrove, maybe we should go home. It's getting late. The old woman shook her head. Not yet, dear. I promise we'll be done soon. She turned onto a narrow side street that led to a deserted park. Lily felt the car bump over broken pavement. The park was a sad stretch of grass and a few barren trees, benches glistening with rain. No other cars were in sight. Mrs. Hargrove pulled into a space near a tall hedge. She rummaged in her purse, pulling out a sealed envelope. Here, she said, extending it to Lily. I need you to place this on that bench by the oak tree. Don't open it. Just set it there and come right back. Lily peered at the envelope, her pulse hammering. Why me? Mrs. Hargrove smiled thinly. It's less suspicious if a child does it, dear. Please hurry. I'm old and can't walk on this slippery ground. With trembling fingers, Lily opened the passenger door, the rain sprinkling against her jacket. She crossed the wet grass, scanning for any sign of people. The park was empty, gray and forlorn. She found the bench under the oak, its wood damp and pitted. She laid the envelope down, her curiosity burning. Should she open it? Fear held her back. She took a step away, then paused, heart pounding. She had to know. She carefully lifted the flap with a fingernail, revealing a folded piece of paper. Her eyes skimmed lines that made her knees weaken. We have your child. Pay the sum by Friday or you'll never see them again. Lily's lungs froze. She read a few more words referencing bank transfers. She realized this was a ransom note. Horror washed over her, and she quickly sealed the envelope before sprinting back to the car. As soon as she ducked inside, the old woman's gaze pinned her. You're quite fast, dear, Mrs. Hargrove said lightly. Let's go. Lily nodded numbly, slamming the door. The envelope was left behind on that bench, a monstrous threat waiting to be found by someone. Lily sank into the seat, her body tense. She had to stifle a scream. Was Mrs. Hargrove orchestrating a kidnapping? They drove away in silence, the wipers slapping at the windshield. Lily considered texting her mother right then, but fear clamped her mind. She pictured Mrs. Hargrove yanking the phone away, or worse. She forced a calm facade, hoping to get through the ride unscathed. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw the old woman pull out her phone again. She dialed a number, speaking in a low tone. The message is delivered. If they don't respond, we proceed. Lily's breath caught. The old woman ended the call without elaboration. As the car merged onto a main road, Lily recognized a different portion of the city. She dared to speak. Mrs. Hargrove, I'm scared. Are we doing something illegal? The old woman's lips pressed into a thin line. She answered softly, Don't fret, Lily. Some things are necessary. These people, they shouldn't have had children at all. I'm only balancing the scales. Tears pricked Lily's eyes. Balancing the scales? You mean hurting people? Mrs. Hargrove's gaze was fixed on the road. Some parents have harmed their children in ways you can't imagine, my dear. They pay me to keep certain secrets, or to avoid bigger disasters. Let's just say I'm making sure justice happens in my own way. Lily felt sick. She couldn't comprehend the twisted logic. Kidnappings, ransoms, hush money, was that what this was about? She recalled the old woman's repeated references to missing children, tragedies. Could it all tie together? She tried to stay composed, but fear gnawed at her insides. By the time they returned to the neighborhood, Lily was on the verge of tears. The car parked in Mrs. Hargrove's driveway. Lily fumbled for the door handle. "I need to go home," she muttered. "Of course," the old woman said pleasantly. "Thank you for helping me tonight, Lily. You really are special. Don't mention our little errand to anyone, okay? It'd be quite troublesome if people misunderstood." Her tone dripped with an implicit threat. Lily stumbled out of the car, her clothes damp from the lingering rain. She rushed to her house, thankful to find both her parents home at last. She burst in, startled Harriet, who was in the kitchen. Harriet saw Lily's tear-streaked face. "Honey, what's wrong?" Lily tried to speak, but words clogged her throat. She settled for, "I'm not feeling well," and dashed to her room. Harriet followed, concerned. Lily slammed the door, leaning against it, heart pounding. After a moment, her mother knocked gently. "Are you okay? Did something happen with Mrs. Hargrove?" Lily sucked in a breath, deciding she had to say something. She let Harriet in, then blurted about the envelope, about the ransom note. Her words tumbled over each other in a breathless rush. Harriet's brow furrowed with deepening worry as Lily described the old woman's phone calls and references to kidnapping. Harriet's immediate reaction was disbelief, or maybe shock. "Lily, that's a serious allegation. Are you sure you read it right?" "Mom, it literally said we have your child and mentioned a sum of money," Lily insisted, tears brimming. "She told me to leave it on a bench in a deserted park. She's blackmailing people." Harriet looked uncertain, torn between the concern in Lily's eyes and the implausibility of her neighbor orchestrating something so vile. Robert, summoned by Harriet's urgent call, joined them in Lily's room. Lily repeated her story, voice shaking. Robert sighed, trying to remain logical. "We'll talk to Mrs. Hargrove," he said. "Maybe it's some misunderstanding." "No," Lily yelped. "She'll deny it. She threatened me or, well, implied I shouldn't tell. She's dangerous." Harriet and Robert exchanged glances, worry painting their features. Harriet said, "We should consider calling the police if you're certain, but we need proof, Lily. That's a big claim. The police will ask for evidence." Lily felt frustration bubble up. "I have the photo of a child with the face cut out," she offered, rummaging in her desk for the picture she'd found behind the couch. She handed it to them. Harriet frowned at it. "That's good, but it doesn't prove she's kidnapping kids. Maybe it's just something from her old albums?" Lily's despair grew. "She's definitely doing something. I can't stand it if you don't believe me." Harriet knelt beside Lily, hugging her. "We believe you're scared, sweetie. We'll keep an eye on her, maybe contact the non-emergency line to see if the police have any record of suspicious behavior. Let's not jump to conclusions without a plan." It wasn't the firm action Lily wanted, but at least it was something. That night, Lily barely slept. She lay awake, replaying the image of that note, the chill in Mrs. Hargrove's voice. Every creak of the house made her jolt. The next morning, Harriet tried the non-emergency police line, explaining that her daughter had found some unsettling materials at a neighbor's. The dispatcher politely noted the concern, but said they'd need more concrete proof to investigate. Harriet hung up, sighing. "They said to call back if we see anything more definitive." Lily wanted to scream in frustration. Definitive? Like a child physically in chains? Over the next few days, Lily tried to steer clear of Mrs. Hargrove. She dreaded the woman's phone calls. She confided in her friend Cassie again, who listened wide-eyed but offered no real solution beyond urging Lily to tell an adult. Lily cursed the fact that every adult aside from her parents would probably dismiss her claims. She considered sneaking into Mrs. Hargrove's house to photograph any incriminating letters, but the thought terrified her. Then Mrs. Hargrove unexpectedly phoned Harriet on a lazy Sunday, sounding as sweet as ever, inviting Lily over for cookies. Harriet stared at the phone in her hand, uneasy. She quietly told the old woman that Lily wasn't feeling well. When she hung up, Harriet turned to Lily. "She's asking for you. Are you comfortable going back there?" Lily shook her head violently. No, but we need proof, right? Maybe I can find something. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. Harriet's eyes widened. I'm not letting you waltz into a dangerous situation. Lily took a breath. Maybe you can come too. We can keep it casual, see if we notice anything suspicious. If she's up to no good, she might slip up. Harriet considered, then reluctantly agreed. They decided Robert would join them as well, but he had errands that couldn't wait, so Harriet said they'd schedule a short visit in the afternoon. Lily's heart thudded with anxiety. She pictured Mrs. Hargrove's guarded expressions, her menacing phone calls. That afternoon, Harriet walked Lily over. They knocked on the door. Mrs. Hargrove opened it, seemingly pleased to see them both. Oh, hello. Good to see you, Harriet. And Lily, darling, are you feeling better? Harriet kept her smile polite. We thought we'd drop by since you mentioned wanting Lily's help. Mrs. Hargrove ushered them into the living room. Lily's gaze darted around, searching for anything incriminating. Harriet glanced at the decor, making small talk about the weather. The old woman responded amicably, though Lily sensed an undercurrent of tension. She wondered if Mrs. Hargrove suspected that Lily had told her mother about the errand. Harriet casually asked about the trunk or old photo albums, hinting that she was curious to see family pictures. Mrs. Hargrove deflected with a gentle laugh. Oh, they're a mess, so scattered. I need to tidy them first. Harriet persisted. Lily mentioned you had interesting stories about relatives. I'd love to hear more. Lily cringed inside, worried that Harriet's approach might be too transparent. Mrs. Hargrove's eyes flicked to Lily, then back to Harriet. Her mouth twitched. Well, it's mostly heartbreak, I'm afraid. Children lost in accidents, betrayals, and so on. Not the sort of thing we want to dwell on over tea. They sat on the couch. The conversation limped along, Harriet trying to find an opening. Lily felt sweat bead on her forehead. She noticed a drawer slightly ajar in a side table. Edging her foot forward, she nudged it open an inch more, hoping Harriet would see. Harriet did glimpse something, a stack of letters. But Mrs. Hargrove stood, moving around the table, subtly pushing the drawer closed with her knee. Harriet's smile wavered. Well, I'm so sorry to hear you've had such sad experiences. If you ever need help with anything, we're next door. Mrs. Hargrove's expression softened into that grandmotherly persona. You're both so kind. Thank you. Lily and Harriet exchanged a glance. They were getting nowhere. After a few more strained minutes, Harriet stood, thanking the old woman for her time, explaining they had to run errands. As they departed, Lily felt an overwhelming sense of defeat. She knew her mother hadn't seen enough to be convinced of wrongdoing. Once outside, Harriet murmured, I don't trust her. There's something off. But we don't have evidence. Lily nodded miserably. They went home, Lily feeling like the tension was building toward an inevitable crisis. She feared what would happen if Mrs. Hargrove realized the extent of Lily's suspicions. That night, Lily woke to her phone buzzing. She groggily checked it. A text from an unknown number read, I saw you your mom. Keep quiet or you'll regret it. Lily's blood turned to ice. H had to mean Hargrove. She felt a wave of nausea. How did Mrs. Hargrove get her number? Possibly from Harriet's phone or some other cunning way. Lily realized the old woman was threatening her. She typed a shaky reply, Please leave me alone. No response came. The next day, Lily showed Harriet the text. Harriet's face went grim. We have to call the police again, she said. This time they managed to get a detective on the phone, explaining the threatening message. The detective said they could file a report, and asked if Lily could forward a screenshot. Lily did so, her hands trembling. The detective sounded cautious but somewhat encouraging, saying they would assign someone to look into Mrs. Hargrove's background. Harriet and Lily felt a spark of hope. A few days passed with no direct confrontation from Mrs. Hargrove. Lily stayed out of her yard except for quick trips to the mailbox. She jumped at every shadow. Harriet asked the detective if they'd found anything, but they replied they were still searching records. Then, late one evening, Lily's phone buzzed again, a different message. "We have unsettled business. Meet me alone, or I'll come find you." Lily stifled a cry of fear and ran to show Harriet. Harriet called the detective's number, leaving an urgent voicemail. They decided Lily would not leave the house for anything unless accompanied by her parents. Less than 24 hours later, Harriet took Lily grocery shopping, wanting to keep her close. When they returned, Harriet gasped to see the front door of their home ajar. Inside, they found a window shattered, furniture disturbed. Lily's heart pounded. Had Mrs. Hargrove broken in? The only items missing were small valuables, a few trinkets from Harriet's jewelry box. But more disturbing was a photograph taped to the fridge, Lily's school picture with the eyes scratched out. Harriet called the police in a panic, and an officer arrived to take a statement. Lily told him everything about the old woman, the ransom note, the text threats. The officer listened with a serious expression but asked for definitive proof tying Mrs. Hargrove to the break-in. There was no forced entry linking to her specifically. No one had seen her. While Harriet and Robert spoke to the officer, Lily stood in the kitchen, shaking with fear. She noticed a small piece of crocheted lace near the living room window, one that looked like it matched the doilies in Mrs. Hargrove's house. She whispered to Harriet, showing her. The officer bagged it as potential evidence. Perhaps that might help. Yet the officer warned them that without a direct fingerprint or witness, it was still circumstantial. Terrified and furious, Harriet insisted Lily not be left alone, and Robert decided to take a few days off work if possible. Lily barely slept that night, consumed by nightmares of the old woman dragging her away in the darkness. She woke up multiple times, checking the locks. Finally, the detective Harriet had spoken to, a man named Detective Alvarez, called them back. He said Mrs. Hargrove's real name might not be Hargrove at all. She had a suspicious trail of addresses, often living briefly in different towns. Lily listened on speaker, her pulse racing. Detective Alvarez explained that local authorities in another county had an open case about blackmail letters connected to missing children. The older woman described by those families sounded eerily like Mrs. Hargrove. Lily's parents stared at each other in shock. The detective recommended they come down to the station to share any details they had, especially Lily's account. Harriet agreed. They spent an hour at the police station, Lily recounting every detail, from the strange phone calls to the envelope in the park. Detective Alvarez's eyes gleamed with interest. "We've suspected an organized ring that manipulates or outright orchestrates kidnappings for ransom, with multiple older individuals facilitating communications," he said. "If your neighbor is part of that ring, she might be playing a bigger role than we realize." Lily was both relieved to be believed and petrified that her neighbor might be part of something so large. Detective Alvarez arranged for patrol cars to drive by their street more often. He advised Lily's parents to keep Lily under close watch. He also suggested placing a hidden camera outside their front door, hoping to catch Mrs. Hargrove if she tried anything else. Harriet and Robert nodded, wanting to do whatever it took. The tension in Lily's house was suffocating. Harriet took time off work to stay home. Robert installed the camera above the porch. Lily half expected Mrs. Hargrove to vanish, but the old woman's lights still came on at night, her curtains drawn. One afternoon, Harriet spotted her strolling down the sidewalk with a cane, as though nothing was wrong. Harriet hurriedly closed the curtains so they wouldn't make eye contact. Lily felt a swirl of dread. Was Mrs. Hargrove planning another move? Days crept by. Detective Alvarez kept in touch, saying they were monitoring the woman's house, but so far, no cause for arrest had emerged. The envelope in the park was gone by the time police arrived there, no sign of who picked it up. Lily felt like they were locked in a silent war with a cunning adversary, waiting to see who would strike next. Then, on a chilly Wednesday evening, Lily's phone dinged with another message from the unknown number. "Bring me the small black envelope from under my porch or you'll regret ignoring me." Lily stared at it, confused. A black envelope under her porch? She realized the text might have been meant for someone else. Or was this the old woman's attempt to manipulate Lily into some new scheme? Lily showed Harriet, who called Detective Alvarez. He told them not to respond, to see if the old woman would approach Lily in person. The following day, Harriet escorted Lily on a short walk around the block, thinking a bit of fresh air might help break the fear. As they passed Mrs. Hargrove's house, the old woman suddenly emerged, calling, "Harriet, Lily, wait. I need to speak with you." Harriet stiffened, stepping protectively in front of Lily. "We have nothing to say to you," Harriet snapped. Mrs. Hargrove wore a sorrowful expression, her voice cracking. "I understand you're upset. But you've misunderstood me. Please, let me explain." Harriet shook her head. "Explain what? Breaking into our home? Threatening my daughter?" The old woman's eyes flashed with momentary anger, then softened. "I only want to protect children. You can't imagine the horrors out there." Harriet scoffed, pulling Lily away. Lily caught the old woman's gaze. It was full of some twisted pity. She felt goosebumps crawl over her arms. They hurried home, locking the door behind them. That evening, Harriet got a call from Detective Alvarez. He sounded urgent. "We have a partial match on your neighbor's fingerprints from an old extortion case in another state. We're building enough for a warrant, but we want a bit more direct evidence. If you can get anything else, let us know immediately." Harriet told Lily about it, and Lily's stomach knotted. They needed more evidence. She thought about the trunk, the letters, the cutout photos. If they could get photographic proof, maybe it would be enough. Harriet was reluctant to let Lily near that house again, but Lily insisted. "I know where some of these items might be," she said. Harriet grimaced, knowing the risk. They decided to talk it over with Detective Alvarez, who suggested a controlled operation. Lily would go to the house wired with a small audio recorder, accompanied by Harriet waiting outside or nearby. The detective's men would be in the vicinity. Harriet was torn, but Lily felt resolute. She couldn't rest until Mrs. Hargrove was stopped. Harriet eventually agreed, tears in her eyes. "Promise me you'll be careful," she whispered, hugging Lily. A plan took shape. One late afternoon, Lily mustered her courage and approached Mrs. Hargrove's front door alone. She wore a hoodie, inside which a small device recorded audio. Harriet stood on the sidewalk, looking like she was merely checking her phone, while a plainclothes officer lingered in a car across the street. Lily knocked, heart pounding. Mrs. Hargrove answered, face inscrutable. "Oh, Lily, you came back. I'm glad." Lily forced a smile. I wanted to talk. Maybe we can clarify things?" The old woman seemed to weigh her words, then nodded, stepping aside. Lily entered, her stomach twisting. The door closed behind them with a soft thud that sounded ominous. Mrs. Hargrove gestured to the living room. Lily noticed the trunk was gone, replaced by a tidy arrangement of chairs. The old woman said, "I'm happy you realized I'm not your enemy." Lily swallowed hard. "Yes, I just want to understand what you meant about balancing the scales." Mrs. Hargrove's eyes gleamed. "You're an insightful girl, Lily. Many parents out there are unfit. They neglect or harm their own children. Sometimes the law can't handle them all. I help ensure those children find better situations, or that the parents pay for their sins." Lily's voice trembled. "But aren't you the one sending ransom notes?" A flicker of annoyance crossed the old woman's face. "That's a crude way to put it. I orchestrate certain negotiations. The threat of losing a child is sometimes the only way to make the parents see reason. If they're truly harmful, I place the child elsewhere. If they pay to fix their behavior, I might return the child, but under watch. One can't rely on social services alone, dear. Sometimes you must take matters into your own hands." Lily's mind reeled. This was a confession of vigilante-like abductions, or extortion at the very least. She prayed the recorder was capturing every word. She tried not to show how horrified she felt. "So you kidnapped them? That's a crime." Mrs. Hargrove smiled sweetly. "People call it kidnapping, but I see it as rescue. The money covers costs, ensures future good behavior. It's for the children's own safety. No monster, Lily. She stepped closer, her tone almost affectionate. I recognize something in you. You felt overshadowed, perhaps. We share a certain empathy for children who suffer. Lily forced herself not to recoil. She saw that the living room closet door was partially ajar, possibly revealing more boxes. She gestured timidly. Did your family do that too? You mentioned kidnappings in your extended family. The old woman's eyes darkened. Let's just say it runs in certain circles. My sister and I had to learn how to keep children safe from monstrous parents. If that means scaring them into compliance, so be it. I never kill. I never truly harm the child. But the parents pay dearly, as they should. Lily's voice shook. You blackmailed them all these years? She inched toward the closet, trying to keep the conversation going. Mrs. Hargrove nodded. The secrecy is vital. That's why I can't have meddling outsiders. I regret threatening you, but you left me no choice. Lily's chest tightened. She laid a hand on the closet door, pushing it open slightly. Mrs. Hargrove's eyes flicked there. What are you doing? She asked, suspicion lacing her voice. In that moment, Lily caught a glimpse of boxes labeled with names or dates. She saw Johnson family scrawled on one, Reynolds child on another. The third read Parker incident. Before she could read more, Mrs. Hargrove lunged forward, grabbing Lily's wrist. You shouldn't be prying, she hissed, her sweet facade evaporating. Lily gasped, heart thrashing. She forced herself to remain calm. If the recorder captured this assault, it might be enough for the police to intervene. She tried to yank free. Mrs. Hargrove's grip was surprisingly strong. You're hurting me, Lily cried. The old woman's face contorted with anger. You have no idea how many people would pay to keep these secrets hidden. I won't let you ruin everything. Lily's breath came in ragged gulps. She thought of Harriet outside. She needed to stall. I'm sorry, she said, her eyes watering. I just want to help. Mrs. Hargrove's face softened a fraction. She let go of Lily's wrist, then stared at her suspiciously. Help how? Lily swallowed. Maybe I can do errands like before, deliver notes, keep it quiet. I understand now, you do it to protect kids, right? She tried to mimic the old woman's twisted logic, hoping to buy time. Mrs. Hargrove studied her face, searching for deceit. Lily fought to keep her expression earnest. The old woman finally nodded. Yes, that's the spirit. You see, dear, it's necessary. I've seen so many children battered, neglected. The authorities fail them. Only we can intervene. Lily felt a wave of revulsion, but forced a nod. Right? Intervene. She sneaked a glance at the front window, hoping Harriet or the detective would come bursting in. Then she heard a faint noise from outside, the scuff of shoes on the porch. Mrs. Hargrove, on edge, snapped her gaze toward the window. Did you bring someone with you? Her voice shot up an octave, anger returning. Lily's heart hammered. No, I... Before she could finish, the front door flew open. Harriet stood there, eyes blazing, Detective Alvarez behind her, one hand on his holstered weapon. Lily, get over here, Harriet cried. Lily darted forward. Mrs. Hargrove let out a guttural cry. You tricked me. She lurched, perhaps to grab Lily again, but Alvarez stepped in, commanding, back away, hands where I can see them. Another officer rushed inside. Mrs. Hargrove's face twisted in fury, then a bizarre calm settled over her. She lifted her hands slowly, glancing around as if caged. Alvarez instructed an officer to cuff her while Harriet flung her arms around Lily, trembling with relief. Lily's entire body shook with adrenaline. She heard the old woman's voice behind them, bitter, "You've ruined a good cause. More children will suffer now." Alvarez read her rights, ignoring her outburst. Another officer rummaged around the house, discovering the boxes of letters and notes, the trunk stashed in a closet. Lily exhaled in a rush, certain they'd find all the evidence needed. As they led Mrs. Hargrove away, Harriet guided Lily outside, tears streaming down her cheeks. Lily caught a glimpse of the old woman's face, no longer sweet or grandmotherly, just a cold glare. The swirl of police lights lit up the yard. A small crowd of neighbors gathered, whispering. Lily buried her face in Harriet's shoulder, overwhelmed. Detective Alvarez approached, his expression relieved. "We got it all on tape, Lily. Her admission, the threatening behavior. Great job." Lily mustered a shaky smile, tears spilling. They spent hours giving statements, letting the officers photograph or catalog everything. Harriet stayed glued to Lily's side, repeatedly apologizing for not believing her sooner. Lily just clung to her mother, grateful it was finally over. She learned that the letters found included detailed instructions about removing children from their homes, demands for hush money, references to victims from multiple states. It was a trove of incriminating evidence. The police also discovered pictures of missing children, some never returned to their families, fueling a broader investigation. In the days that followed, Lily's story became local news. The press latched onto the shocking narrative of an elderly neighbor orchestrating abductions. Harriet shielded Lily from the media as best she could. Detective Alvarez visited, updating them that Mrs. Hargrove, whose real name was Margaret Hannah Grimsby, was cooperating in parts, naming co-conspirators in exchange for a reduced sentence. They were building a case against an entire ring. Lily felt a surge of relief that she'd helped stop this, but sadness that so many children had been terrified or hurt along the way. One morning, Harriet called Lily to the living room. She pointed at a weathered newspaper article in her hand, one the detective had shared. It showed that about a decade ago, a toddler bearing some resemblance to Lily had nearly been abducted at a supermarket. The suspect was never caught. The date matched the timeline Lily had seen in the news clipping in Mrs. Hargrove's glove compartment. Harriet's face was pale. "It could have been you," she whispered. Lily felt chills. She remembered the slight scar on her arm from a childhood fall. She never linked it to an attempted abduction. Harriet held her trembling hand. "I never told you the whole story, but you did go missing for a few minutes that day in the store. We found you crying near the entrance. Could Mrs. Hargrove have been involved?" Lily's mind reeled. If that old woman had targeted her, it was horrifying and surreal. She recalled how Mrs. Hargrove sometimes gave her an odd look, as though calculating something. Perhaps the kidnapping had failed back then, but the old woman recognized Lily years later. The notion made her sick to her stomach. Harriet squeezed her shoulder. "At least she's caught now. She can't ever do anything to you or anyone else again." As weeks turned into months, Lily tried to restore some normalcy. Neighbors whispered about her bravery. She felt no pride in it, only relief that the threat was gone. Harriet and Robert arranged therapy sessions for Lily, worried about her lingering nightmares. She found it helped to talk about the fear, to process the sense of betrayal that someone she tried to be kind to had used her. She also realized how lucky she was that Harriet, Robert, and eventually the police took her seriously enough to intervene. Detective Alvarez occasionally dropped by, sharing updates that the ring was being dismantled in multiple towns. More children would be spared the terror of abduction. Lily took solace in that, though she mourned for those who'd already suffered. She learned that some kids were recovered, but others were never found, likely smuggled out of state or worse. The heartbreak weighed on her, spurring her to vow never to ignore suspicious behavior again. Her parents became more protective, but they also encouraged her to continue living her life. She returned to school, found comfort in her friends, and discovered new strength within herself. No longer did she feel like a quiet observer. She had confronted a genuine evil and come out scarred but not broken. That realization gave her a certain confidence, an understanding that doing the right thing sometimes meant standing alone. Months later, Harriet showed Lily a finalized report indicating Mrs. Hargrove had been sentenced to a lengthy prison term. Lily felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. She remembered the small moments of kindness that had seemed genuine, fresh cookies, gentle smiles. Yet it was all overshadowed by a twisted mission to manipulate families and separate children from their parents, sometimes for money, sometimes for misguided vengeance. Lily's therapist urged her to see that Mrs. Hargrove had her own warped justification, but that Lily was not to blame for being deceived. As time passed, new residents moved into the house where Mrs. Hargrove once lived. Lily occasionally glanced at the yard, remembering the tension of stepping through that gate. She breathed easier knowing the new family had no connection to the horrors that once lurked behind those walls. She hoped the trunk, the letters, the scissored photos were all sealed away as evidence, never again to haunt another. She focused on moving forward, reading, making new friends, cherishing her parents. The nightmares receded slowly. She found that each day she woke up and didn't see Mrs. Hargrove's looming figure at the fence was a small victory. On a sunny afternoon, she and Harriet planted flowers in their yard, the bright blossoms a symbol of renewal after so much darkness. One evening, Lily sat in her room, writing in her journal. She recounted the entire saga from her perspective, wanting to keep a record in her own words. Tears dotted the page as she relived the fear, the heartbreak, the relief. She concluded with a note of gratitude for the detective who believed her, for her mother who eventually took her side, for the chance to save other children from a similar fate. She realized how crucial it was that she'd spoken up despite everyone initially dismissing her as imaginative. Courage, she learned, wasn't about never feeling scared, it was about acting in spite of that fear. As the months slipped by, Lily grew stronger and more mature. She found herself more outspoken in class, less hesitant to question authority. She saw how her willingness to push for answers had saved lives. She hoped that her story would encourage other kids to trust their instincts, to persist when something felt wrong. Sometimes, late at night, she replayed the memory of riding in that old sedan, envelope in hand, stepping out onto the park bench under the drizzle. She shuddered at how easily she could have been dragged deeper into that criminal world. Then she would remind herself that she escaped, that justice was served. She was safe now, with Harriet's gentle presence in the next room and Robert's quiet protective strength. They had faced a nightmare and come out together. One day, a local journalist approached Harriet about writing an article highlighting Lily's bravery. Harriet talked to Lily, who felt uneasy about the spotlight. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that sharing her experience might help others see the signs of hidden crimes. She agreed to an interview. The article came out with the headline, "Local Girls' Quick Thinking Helps End Kidnapping Ring." The piece praised Lily's courage, detailing her initial suspicions and final confrontation. It also mentioned how her mother backed her up, and how a dedicated detective sealed the case. The community buzzed for a while. Lily fielded new attention at school, some admiration, some jealousy. But she handled it with quiet grace, politely deflecting questions that felt invasive. Eventually, the fuss died down. Still, every so often, Lily would catch a random whisper in the hallway, "That's the girl who uncovered a kidnapping scheme." She'd smile politely and keep walking, not eager to dwell on those memories. She was eager to resume a normal childhood, if any normalcy could exist after such an ordeal. Late one summer afternoon, Harriet and Lily decided to organize a small neighborhood get-together, inviting the new family in Mrs. Hargrove's former house, plus a few other neighbors. Lily helped set up chairs in the backyard. Robert grilled hot dogs, and Harriet laid out lemonade. The air was warm, the sky streaked with pink clouds. Lily found herself able to enjoy the moment, to laugh with the new neighbors about mundane things like the best place to buy produce. The lingering shadow of Mrs. Hargrove's crimes felt distant, though not entirely gone. At one point, Harriet and Lily sneaked into the kitchen for more lemonade. Harriet touched Lily's shoulder gently. "You've grown up a lot this year, you know," she said, eyes moist with emotion. "I wish it could have been without all that terror, but I'm so proud of you for standing up for what was right." Lily blinked back tears, hugging her mom. "I wouldn't have been brave enough if you hadn't finally believed me," she whispered. Harriet kissed her hair. I believe you always, Lily. Sometimes I just need a little convincing, she joked softly, both of them sharing a tearful laugh. After the gathering, as dusk settled, Lily strolled to the mailbox to retrieve the day's letters. She felt no fear stepping outside now, no longer scanning the shadows for a menacing figure. She opened the mailbox, flipping through the usual bills and flyers. Then one envelope caught her eye. No return address, her name typed on the front. She tensed, her breath hitching. Carefully, she tore it open. Inside was a simple typed message. I'm sorry. I wish things could have been different. No signature. Lily's heart pounded. Could it be from Mrs. Hargrove, sent from prison? Or maybe another accomplice? She rushed inside, showing Harriet and Robert. They stared, shaken. Harriet called Detective Alvarez, who advised them to bring the letter in for examination. Lily handed it over the next day. The detective confirmed the writing style matched older letters from Hargrove's stash. Possibly it was a last attempt at contact. Lily felt a swirl of conflicting emotions, anger, pity, fear. She realized that no matter how twisted Mrs. Hargrove's motives, a part of her probably did see herself as a savior of children. But that didn't excuse the crimes. Summer transitioned into a golden autumn. Lily entered a new grade at school, forging ahead. She joined a book club to channel her love of reading mysteries into more positive pursuits. Occasionally, Harriet and Robert would gently check if Lily needed to talk about any lingering nightmares. Lily admitted they still came but less frequently. Time soothed the raw edges. One crisp evening, as Lily and Harriet sipped hot chocolate in the living room, Harriet asked, "Have you thought about becoming a detective or journalist someday? You have quite the knack for uncovering secrets." Lily smiled into her mug. "Maybe. But for now, I just want to be a kid who does the right thing when it counts." Harriet squeezed her daughter's hand. "That's already more than enough." And so life continued, gradually overshadowing the dark chapter that began with Lily's well-intentioned visits to Mrs. Hargrove's kitchen. The old house next door was painted a cheerful yellow by the new owners. Its once mysterious interior turned into a normal suburban home. Sometimes Lily caught a glimpse of those new neighbors laughing in the yard, children playing without fear. She felt a pang of gratitude that the house no longer concealed sinister secrets. Time marched on. Detective Alvarez occasionally sent updates, the final one indicating that Margaret Hannah Grimsby, aka Mrs. Hargrove, had pleaded guilty to multiple charges of conspiracy and extortion. She might never walk free again, especially with the additional allegations from across state lines. Lily reread that message with a sense of finality. She reminded herself that no matter how normal a street might appear, evil can lurk behind lace curtains. But so can heroes, even if they're just a quiet girl with a love of mysteries, determined not to let an old woman's manipulations go unchecked. On a late autumn evening, Lily sat by her bedroom window, gazing at the bare branches swaying in the wind. The memory of that first phone call, the text threats, the envelope in the park, all flickered through her mind. She felt the weight of how close she'd been to utter disaster. Then she remembered how Harriet burst through the door with Detective Alvarez, that rush of relief when the old woman's vile intentions were finally laid bare. Lily breathed deeply, tears moistening her lashes. She had survived, grown, and helped put an end to a terrible scheme. She vowed that if she ever saw another sign of a child in danger, she wouldn't hesitate to speak out, and keep speaking until someone listened. Her father knocked softly, stepping in to say goodnight. Lily gave him a quick hug, the moment filled with unspoken gratitude. After he left, Lily closed her eyes, feeling the night's hush settle around her. She recalled the question that began all this. Where are you watching from, and do you believe in standing against hidden wrongdoing? She could almost imagine she was talking to anyone who might hear her story. Then she fell into a deep sleep, dreaming not of nightmares but of possibilities, of shining a light into dark corners so children could remain safe and families wouldn't have to pay ransom for their loved ones. She slept peacefully, ready for the dawn. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, Give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.